We're learning more about Tuesday's Southwest flight explosion. Investigators now believe an engine blade blew apart. One woman was killed after nearly being sucked out of the plane. The passenger who tried to save her spoke to the media earlier.
I'm trained for emergency situations, and that's just exactly what it was. And felt moved to act, and as well as other people on that plane. Tammy Jo, the pilot, professional in all aspects, and her crew, amazing job.
CBS News transportation correspondent Kris Van Cleave is in Philadelphia and joins us now. Hi, Kris. We've been hearing from passengers who paint a terrifying scene. What more do we know about how those 22 minutes unfolded after the engine blew?
Well, once the engine blew, the plane pitched to about a 41-degree angle briefly while the pilots resumed control. It also depressurized the cabin, so the pilots had to very abruptly and aggressively descend to get to a lower altitude. The oxygen masks came down, and the experience, there was a lot of vibration noise heard on the voice recorder, which would tell you that there was a lot of turbulence, a lot of shaking, a lot of noise. It certainly would have been a terrifying experience for somebody on board that plane.
Oh, indeed. Now, Kris, we know that a fan blade broke off due to metal fatigue. How concerned is the NTSB about the risk of this happening to other planes? I understand that it happened in a part of the engine that's not easy to see from a manual inspection.
Well, the metal fatigue on the fan blade was in a place that would be very hard, if not impossible, to see with the human eye, because it was on the inside, basically the inside part of the blade. So it would have likely needed some kind of ultrasonic scan to pick it up, or you would have had to pull the blade off the device. You know, the NTSB is not prepared to look beyond this incident yet. They're too early in their investigation to say if what happened here could be an issue for other 737s. You know, it happened to this plane. Southwest flight about 2 years ago had a very, very similar incident. In both cases, those were engines that were fairly at least midlife or later. What they don't know, and keep in mind, the 737 is the most used airliner in the world, and we've heard of 2 of these incidents. So what the NTSB has told us is that they're very concerned about this incident. They're not yet ready to say whether that could mean concern for the entire 737 fleet or the population of planes, or if there needs to be more scrutiny on a wider group of planes than what maybe it was happening now. But certainly, as equipment gets older, you do run the risk of parts wearing out.
Kris, you mentioned that similar incident on a Southwest flight in 2016. Now, we understand that a recommendation was made after that to require ultrasonic inspections. How did Southwest respond to that?
So after the 2016 investigation, the National Transportation Safety Board found that metal fatigue caused a fan blade to break, and that then caused the engine to fail, and a very similar circumstance to this one. The engine manufacturer then put out a service bulletin recommending that engines above a certain number of cycles — a cycle is basically a trip, and on-off is a cycle — needed to be checked in a 6-month period. The FAA then began the process, which can be lengthy, of making that a regulation. Southwest filed in their comments some concerns, expressing some opposition to it being made mandatory, and saying that that 6-month window may not be enough time, that they may need a year to do it, in part because the order called for tracking fan blade numbers in a way that Southwest doesn't track fan blade numbers, so they may have had to inspect their entire fleet of more than 700 737s. But Southwest did oppose the timeline, certainly, in their filing for that. We understand that those inspections have already begun at Southwest. Other airlines have already begun them as well, because when the maker of the engine tells you should probably do something, generally speaking, the airlines are going to do it.
And so what is the FAA doing then in response to this latest incident?
Well, the recommendation that's going to become a requirement is not in response to this incident. In fact, it was pending before this happened. It's been pending since August of last year. It was set to go into effect any day. So there's not a one-to-one relationship there. Certainly there's more urgency and focus now. The FAA is part of the NTSB investigation, and they are watching this very closely as well. And the question really now at the center of this is there a larger problem with components of the engines that are on the 737? That engine has a very long history. It's got a very reliable and a very safe history. So, but then there are a lot of them out there. So if there are fatigue issues that creep in at a certain point, that needs to be figured out, and then whatever testing needs to be done to identify it, and that needs to be done as soon as possible. And I think everyone agrees that needs to happen. The question is, where does that enhanced inspection need to begin, because it's likely not a factor on much newer planes. But a well-maintained 737 can fly for more than 20 years. This one is about 18 years old. Right,
but then you have to wonder what shape is the engine in. That's that's the scary part here after 18 years. But I guess that's what they're working to figure out is when that metal fatigue starts to kick in. Now, Kris, the pilot, Tammy Jo Schultz, is being called a hero. Have we heard from her yet? And what more do we know about how she was able to land the plane safely?
Let me just jump in on something you said there. Yeah, the plane is 18 years old. The engine received a pretty thorough, almost a complete rebuild in 2012. Think of it like an engine on a car. After a certain number of miles, you sort of have to replace components and rebuild it. That happened to this engine, and it's only been about 10,000 cycles since that rebuild, so it may not have even been required to be inspected in that first group of inspections that the FAA is going to require, because it hadn't hit the number that the FAA was asking for. And that's part of why there's now this question: does the pool of what needs scrutiny need to be expanded? As for the pilot, she and her co-pilot put out a statement last night thanking people for their support, saying that in their minds the entire crew just did their jobs, and they added that they have heavy hearts and are thinking about the Reardon family, who certainly lost a mother and a wife in this tragic accident.
Absolutely. Well, Kris Van Cleave, we thank you so much for your reporting.
Sure thing.